What's up, everybody? Welcome again to the Chasing Creativity podcast. This is episode 23 with Dr. Michael Grandner. How's it going, everyone? Starting out 2019 strong, I hope. Making it straight through January here. We're about halfway through, blazing through this month. I hope everyone's having an awesome, morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you're listening. Jumping right in, the song you had just heard is from an electronic music producer known as Sun, and the song is called I Dream. Now, he wanted me to share a couple things, first being the Audio Apostles Collective. Now, a little background here, he's one of the founding members of this Audio Apostles Collective. He does the website, he does a lot of art behind the website and different media for the Audio Apostles Collective. How I first heard about Audio Apostles was through Discord. So I got introduced to their Discord channel maybe about a year ago. And it was when I was fairly new to producing electronic music, and it was such a great way to meet people doing the same thing and get feedback on projects. Everyone is so supportive and just friendly. It's a great place to start. It's a great place to meet other people doing this, as I mentioned, and really grow in your skill as an artist. So anyways, highly recommend checking it out. The website for Audio Apostles is audioapostles.org. And also, he wanted me to speak about his production company known as Serenade Production Studio. He does a lot of digital art and artwork for artists tied with music, tied with a given marketing strategy that someone might have for album art or something like that on Instagram. Really, really skilled individual, so I highly recommend checking out his work. So again, Serenade Production Studio, and that's serenadestudio.myportfolio.com. Now, as we jump into the episode, kind of want to switch gears into news. It being 2019, some changes are starting to happen. The first big one is we have started a Patreon for the podcast. Now, if you're enjoying the episodes, first, just listening on its own is awesome. I really, really appreciate all of you out there simply enjoying the episodes and following us and keeping ties and listening to new episodes as they come out. But if you do want to support the podcast, you can check out the Patreon. We have different tiers that are associated with different reward packages, and it's a great way to support this podcast. So that's simply patreon.com/chasing creativity. Now, reason we've done this is moving into 2019, there's a lot of changes that are coming. So, and those changes there's ideas I have moving forward for what I want this to do. And so your support is just greatly appreciated. I'll kind of leave it at that. And also, one thing I hadn't mentioned with all of this is, over time, my intention is to support the guests as they come on to the podcast. So this all moves in that direction and allows for that to happen. So again, if you are enjoying the episodes, please check out the Patreon, patreon.com/chasing creativity. Now that's it. No more shameless plugs on my end. We're going to start talking about today's episode. I'm moving right in. Dr. Michael Grandner, he is the director of the Sleep and Health Research Program at the University of Arizona. director of the Behavioral Sleep Medicine Clinic at Banner University Medical Center, an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Medicine at the U of A, assistant professor of psychology in the University of Arizona College of Science, assistant professor of nutritional science. So he has made a career of studying sleep, understanding the health benefits of sleep, and understanding the repercussions around lack of sleep. So I get into it at the beginning of this episode, but I thought it was so important for music producers who we don't typically sleep all that much to understand what is going on when a person maybe sleeps 6 or less hours a night, and really what that means for health and longevity. So really interesting conversation. We dig into all that in today's episode, so I really do hope you enjoy it. And that's it. We're going to jump right in. Again, Dr. Michael Gradner. It was an awesome conversation. Hope you all enjoy it and look forward to speaking with you all again soon. Dr. Michael Gradner, how's it going, sir?
Doing great.
Awesome. Thank you for coming on. I'm really excited about this episode.
Yeah, I'm really excited too. I think there's a lot of potential in talking about sleep.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to start out a little bit, I thought it would be fitting to kind of give a little bit of a backstory and kind of why I feel like this is such a fitting conversation for this podcast. And, typical episodes are often music producers speaking about, creativity when they work on their music, or researchers looking at creativity through the lens of their specific research. But one thing I think is oftentimes maybe overlooked is the importance of sleep in this whole thing. So for music producers, myself included, it's almost laughed about when someone will work on music late into the night, and then go to work the next day on almost no sleep, maybe 3 or 4 hours of sleep. And I just think the conversation around the importance of sleep, the benefits of sleep, and the negative repercussions of the lack of sleep aren't really there. So I thought that this is just going to be such a cool episode for that reason.
Excellent. Yeah, I think this is a great topic.
Yeah, cool. So just to tie listeners into who you are, and of course, I want to hand it over to you as well. But I've done my research, and you're the director of the Sleep and Health Research Program at the University of Arizona, director of the Behavioral Sleep Medicine Clinic at Banner University Medical Center, assistant professor of psychology at the U of A, and also assistant professor of nutritional sciences at the University of Arizona. So this is like a lifelong pursuit to better understand the importance and health aspects behind sleep.
Yeah, I mean, sleep is very cool, and I feel very lucky that I get to have my job be to explore and learn and teach about why sleep is so important and learn more about how that works.
Yeah, absolutely. So early on, what got you interested in sleep? I the reason I ask is I watched an interview with you, and how you phrase this is as you kind of jumped around between different things early on in life, kind of finishing on this here.
Yeah, so I mean, I was always interested in sleep. In that, when I was a kid and even as a teenager, I thought dreams were the coolest thing ever. So this is a creativity podcast. Like when I went to college, my intention was to be a music major, music composition,
Awesome.
music production, and that's what I wanted to do. That was my thing, and it ended up not turning out that way. And so after a couple of semesters where really it was the instruction was great, and I learned a lot, but it got to the point where I had to ask myself, do I want to do this as fun and a hobby, or do I want to make this my job? And I decided that I want to keep it as my hobby, and I don't want it to be my job. So what do I want to do? And so I at the time I wrote a lot, and so like, okay, maybe I want to go and be an English major and go into writing or something. Um, and I had taken a psychology course and liked it, but I always had this fascination with dreams and with sleep in general, and this whole idea that on the other side of this world that we live in, there's a whole other world that we create on the fly every day, multiple times a day, actually. and it's rich and it has all of these elements of life in it. It's fun, it's scary, it's important, it's impactful, it's also sometimes mundane, it's confusing. All these things that life are, we create them in our own mind in dreams. I always found that endlessly fascinating. Um, but I didn't realize like I, that could be a job that I could have something to do with. So when I was in college, I had a friend who had gotten a job as a tech at the sleep lab at the hospital affiliated with the university I was at. And I had no idea that sleep medicine was actually a field of scientific inquiry besides stuff I would read somewhere. I didn't know it was like a thing.
Mm.
And she's like, "Oh, I got a job at the sleep lab." And I didn't even know we had one. And I'm like, "Oh, that's awesome. I didn't really realize we had a sleep lab. Could I see it?" She's like, "Oh, yeah, sure." And what really changed everything for me was um, the guy who was running that sleep lab, who had recently started at that university, was teaching a course the next semester in sleep science. And I thought, how cool is that? So I need to take this thing. And so I took the course and I loved it. And I felt like I was learning the story of this field that I thought was endlessly fascinating. And the whole time sitting in that course, I was just thinking that I want to be part of that story. Like this is the coolest story ever, that I can actually build my career around studying the brain and sleep and the body and how this is all connected. And so I worked in that lab for a couple of years as a student and learned about going to grad school and got into a PhD program where it was a psychology PhD program, but I went there because it had a great sleep lab and great sleep and circadian researchers there. And I got to work in those labs as a grad student, and that sort of set off my trajectory. So that's how I got into this.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So, when you were in your PhD and you were doing the research, what specifically then were you looking at? What was the direction of your research, related to sleep?
So I'll rewind a little bit. So when I was still an undergraduate, that first lab I was working in, they were very focused on the connection between sleep and depression.
Mm.
And one of the ways they were looking at this was looking at different brainwave patterns during sleep and whether changes in those brainwave patterns that you see in depressed people versus not depressed people could somehow be a marker for depression, and what are the genetics underlying it, and do they change when you treat the depression or when you treat the sleep problems. um, and then they were also looking at sort of brainwave activity and insomnia, looking at things like how a lot of people with insomnia, um, when you bring them into the lab and study their sleep, they sleep way better than they think they do if
Mm.
you observe them. And part of the reason is that it looks like there's something going on in the brain in people with insomnia that's a little different. And it might be that there's parts of the brain that are awake where they don't belong, where they should
Ah.
be asleep. And so this lab was studying things like that connection between um, the neuroscience of depression and sleep and insomnia and how all that fits together and how that gives us information about how this stuff works. But the lab I was in as a grad student was actually quite different. Um, it was They were still interested in sleep and depression, but my graduate advisor, he wasn't as much into the brainwave activity. He was very interested in this area of circadian rhythms,
Mm.
and the observation that he had made was this issue that if you look at a lot of species of mammals that hibernate in the winter, when as the day gets shorter, it triggers these biological changes that cause animals, for example, to reduce their activity, to socially withdraw, sex organs atrophy, all these they consume larger quantities of food, and sort of they get into this hibernation mode. And he had made this observation a long time ago that maybe part of what we see as seasonal depression before the term existed, maybe part of depression is actually that same underlying biology that, when the days get shorter, we have this vestigial biology that makes us withdraw and slow down and want to stay in bed all day when it's cold and dark, and
Mm.
and which leads to a sort of different form of depression that they used to call atypical depression, where instead of insomnia, you were in bed a lot. Instead of having no appetite, you kind of ate more, um, and socially withdrew. And basically, the hypothesis was, in our modern society, we don't spend much time outdoors anyway. So a lot of our days are abnormally dark compared to how we evolved. And so his research was very much into understanding that connection. But there was also a side story there about sleep in society, and that just in general, the people who are getting more sleep or less sleep than the average don't live as long. And he was
Ah,
very interested into why that was. And so, what are instead of these bigger effects in a smaller group of people that create these drastic changes, what's happening subtly in the population that's leading to, a few percent difference in mortality rates? But when you translate that to millions of people, that actually becomes really important. So, is that dual focus of depression, circadian rhythms, and then society and health. And it was actually the latter one that really got me, because it was something he said once, when I said, well, if you're so interested in circadian rhythms, depression, why are you looking at these population level things that are less precisely measured? And he's like, look, you know, my motivation is, how do I do the most good for the most people? And
mm,
for a different question, it requires a different answer. And I think that, yeah, these effects they're less precise, and maybe 20 years from now we'll have more information, and now we do. Um, but instead of a big impact in a smaller number of people, this can actually impact society at large. We just need people to start paying attention to it. And interestingly enough, like many things in his career, he was about 10, 15 years ahead of the curve. And now we're talking about sleep and health in society.
right. Oh, that's so interesting because I have friends who have gone through the med school program at the University of Arizona, and oftentimes they've even echoed to me as well that sleep and just overall health, approaching something before there needs to be kind of the intervention of medicine isn't as much addressed as it, or it hasn't been in the past as much as it is today. It's becoming much more accepted, these different ways to find a healthy balance in your life rather than kind of, I don't want to say patching it up with medicine, but it's all of these other lifestyle choices that can really influence someone's overall health.
Yeah, we're learning about how important that really is.
Mm.
Where sleep, if you look at the sleep field 20 years ago, it was either like basic neuroscientists studying how the brain works and what are the switches and the circuits that are controlling sleep wake cycles using animals and mice, and that you can chop open their brains and see how it works, or they were like sleep doctors treating disorders like, how do you treat insomnia, how do you treat sleep apnea, which was only discovered really in the 1980s,
Mm.
and really didn't become popular till the 90s. And now we know that one out of about every 5 men over age 30 actually has some sort of sleep apnea disorder, probably, especially if they're overweight, and then the rates go even up further. So we're learning all about these treating of these disorders, but not the idea of sleep as a domain of health, like
Mm.
diet, like physical activity, like stress. It's just sort of, that wasn't where the attention was. But if you think about it, what are the biological requirements for human life? What do you need, or else you're going to physically die? You need food, you need water, you need air, and you need sleep.
Yep.
That's pretty much it. Um, and no one's arguing that clean water is really a luxury that we can't really just afford.
Right. Agreed.
And no one's arguing that clean air is for people with too much free time.
Right.
It shouldn't be a priority. But we do for sleep. And I think it's because we're unconscious when it happens, we're not really consciously aware of the connections. Um, but when you think about it, cultures forever have seen sleep as important. It's only really since the Industrial Revolution, and we started seeing sleep as unproductive time,
Mm.
that this attitude really sort of took hold. And it's had a good run for 100 years or so. But I think it's had its time, and now we're starting to realize that we were quite wrong.
Yeah, I definitely want to get into that in that shift because it's common among people working, right, to minimize the amount of sleep so that they can work more, just to fit, even if they want some type of work life balance, excuse me. It There's so little time at home that I think hours get shaved off in that window that someone might be sleeping. But to stay high level here for a moment before we really dig into that, what is the scientific consensus then on a good number of hours of sleep? Is it somewhere in the 7 to 9 range? To start there, what's that look like?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different consensus documents out there, and they're generally in agreement
Mm,
um, that 7 hours on average is probably enough for a typical adult.
mm,
Some people might need eight. Eight, it might not be necessarily better, but eight is also in the range of what's recommended. Nine seems to be about the upper limit for a typical adult. Um, People who are sleeping less than seven, and when I say that, I really mean six or less. We actually don't know much about 6.5, to be honest.
mm.
Um, but 6 or less hours of sleep. So if you're sleeping 6 or less hours of sleep, not only are you more likely to die sooner, you're about 55% more likely to become obese if you weren't before in the same time period compared to someone who's sleeping 7 to 8 hours. You are about 20% more likely to develop high blood pressure, all other things being equal. You're about 30% more likely to develop diabetes, all other things being equal. It's because the body requires sleep to perform maintenance. And when you're not able to, it's sort of like, well, if you only change your oil every 7,000 miles, your car's not going to last as long and things are going to stop working properly. Um, and but you won't notice it after the first two oil changes. It's going to take some time for those things to build up. And that's what happens with sleep too. Um, More than 9 hours is actually usually associated with bad outcomes too. People who are sleeping on average 9, 10, 11 hours per night also don't live as long. They also have health issues. It's harder to understand why, because in our society, the only people sleeping 10, 11 hours a night are people who don't have jobs.
Mm.
So, which means they're either retired, which being older is you have a greater likelihood of other health problems. Even if you statistically control for it, it's hard to remove it. And also, or you're not employed. And if you're not older but not employed, usually that means some sort of disability or inability to work, which usually means some other health issue. So it's hard to know what the long sleep issue is. There's probably such thing as too much sleep. There's too much of anything, but that's usually not our problem. Our problem is that we're not getting enough for most people who are having a sleep issue. Um, there's also, I don't want to forget that duration is just one dimension. Quality is another dimension. There's plenty of people who are getting 7 to 8 hours of sleep and they wake up feeling like crap, and their sleep is of poor quality. Usually, that's either because they have insomnia, um, or which they could get treated. And a quick plug that the recommended first line treatment for insomnia is not sleeping pills. It's actually CBTI, but we can talk about that later if you want.
Yeah, absolutely.
And because it's not medication and it works as well or better than any prescription medication on the market without the side effects. It's just a lot of people don't know about it. Um, or sleep apnea, which is highly undertreated and underdiagnosed. So a lot of times when people wake up exhausted and they're kind of struggling to get through the day and they're chasing after sleep, um, their issue is actually an undiagnosed sleep disorder, or another medical condition that's interfering with their sleep. So even if you're getting enough, it's like nutrition. Just because you're consuming enough calories, um, that's just step one. Then it's what are you eating? Where, if you're not consuming enough calories, I don't care what you're eating, you're not consuming enough calories. But if you're consuming enough, let's look at the quality.
Right, right, and that kind of ties or brings to mind something else as well. Then, so if say there are periods in a person's life where they're sleeping, not so much, right? I think of someone having a baby, for instance, right? They're not sleep; those parents aren't sleeping at all, or going through a tough undergraduate or graduate program and there's little sleep. Are these things? If say you have a time in your life where you're not sleeping very much for say 6 months or a year, is that going to follow you through the rest of your life, or are these reversible if say after that time period you then make sure you're sleeping the recommended 7-ish hours a night?
For both good and bad, sleep is a lot like diet. It's the
Mm.
same as saying, I went through 6 months to a year of my life where I ate like crap. Is this going to follow me forever? Well, if you continue eating like crap, then yes. If you've put on 20 pounds and now you have to lose it, it'll require a little bit of effort to do that. And I'm jokingly saying a little bit because it might require some substantial effort to sort of get back on track. Sleep is a little easier in that regard, and a little more forgiving. But it's the same thing. Was there permanent damage? I mean, if you ate really bad and damaged your organs, then there might be something permanent there,
Mhm.
but maybe not. Likely not. It's just like if people say, "Well, I only slept for 6 hours during the week. How much do I need to sleep on the weekend to make it up?" I say that's like saying I ate nothing but cheeseburgers for 5 days. How much salad do I need to eat on Saturday to erase that?
Right.
It doesn't quite work that way, but it also means that you don't have to pay it all back. All you need to do is course correct and get back on track. You don't have
Mhm.
to overcorrect. Um, you don't have to pay back hour for hour. If you need 7 but got 6 for 5 days, you don't need 12 on Saturday. You just need maybe 8, to make up for a little bit of lost time. But then stay at 7 or 8 for a little while, and normalize. Does that make
Right.
sense?
Well, then, so does that kind of then maybe throw out the idea of sleeping less during the week and trying to catch up on the weekend? Is that something that's kind of debunked at this point?
Yes and no.
Mm.
It is in the sense that it's just like eating a bad diet for 5 days of the week and then eating healthy on the weekends. I mean, it's still not good for you, but it's better than eating like crap 7 days a week.
Right.
And it's probably better, unless you're overcompensating. And so a lot of people do is then they sleep in so much on the weekend that it throws off their sleep for the next week anyway.
Mm.
So you don't want to be at any extremes, but sleeping in a little bit on the weekends, I don't have much of a problem with, unless you're oversleeping by like hours, which is a sign that you're starving. And if you're so starving, what are you doing that's wrong? And this is where I want to make mention of an idea
Mm.
that is very simple, but I think a lot of people haven't thought of it this way. That we see sleep as a cost of time. Like, like we want to go out to eat at the end of the month. How much money is left in my account? So what can I afford? And so we've gone through our day. How much time is left in the bank that I can spend? Right?
Mm.
But I would challenge people to not see it that way. Sleep is not an expense. Sleep is an investment. So the more that you can invest in healthy sleep, the more you're able to be better during the day. So what if the reason you don't have time is because you are more inefficient, or you're not making as good decisions, or you're taking on too much, or you're not performing at your peak? What if I could give you that time? And like they say, you got to spend money to make money. And that's sort of how it is with sleep and performance, where it's not about let's clear out your day to give you time for sleep. It's let's get you a healthy sleep schedule, which will better help you manage your day.
Interesting. I like how you address that. I think that's really important because I think it is an investment. I mean, from the research I've looked at before our conversation and just having this conversation with you now, especially the statistics you mentioned prior when you said anything under 6, all cause mortality goes through the roof. I mean, it's I think the challenge or what people like to easily forget about is that that's down the road, right? People will say, "Okay, I'm fine, whatever. I'm going to be fine. I can do it. I don't feel tired if I sleep less than 6 hours. Those are other people, right?" But it's not that way. It's the majority of people, right, in society. If you find that you're sleeping less than say 6 hours, it's extremely detrimental to one's health. It's yeah.
When we ask people, if I told you that lack of sleep can lead to, say, heart disease or
Mm.
diabetes or cancer or whatever, would you believe me? And most people would say, yeah, at this point, I'll buy that.
Mm.
A generation ago, maybe not, but now most people agree with that. But then when you follow up with the question, would that change your behavior? Usually people say no.
Ah, yeah.
And when I talk to other sleep researchers about this, 'cause I do a lot of work in the community, and they get very surprised when people say that. Like, but don't they want to lower their blood pressure and live longer? I'm like, yeah, but what if I told you that I had a great example. It's off the tip of my tongue. Um, I forgot.
No, it's all right.
But so it's like some other health behavior, or like, what if I told you that eating soup every day would make you healthy? Would you change your whole diet around that? No, people wouldn't
Mm.
can't do it, because they say, well, they would say, the point is, when we ask people why not, why wouldn't changing your sleep schedule, why wouldn't you do that, even if you know it'll make you healthier and prevent heart disease, whatever? Their answer is, everything causes heart disease. On the list of things in my life that cause heart disease, um, this is not that high on the things that I'm going to change. If I really wanted to reduce my heart disease risk, I'd be eating better and exercising more. But I'm not doing that, so I'm not doing this. But when you ask people what would actually make a difference, and that's what I think is really important. When you ask people, what could I tell you that would convince you to change your behavior?
Mm.
And the main themes that emerge are, number one, weight loss. They say, if this can help me lose weight, I'll do it. And number two is work performance and money. And like, will this help me earn more money? Will this help me be more productive?
Right.
The third one that often comes up that people talk about is mental health. Like, if it will help me feel more on top of things and feel better during the day, I'd be willing to do it. And the good news is, sleep does hit on all those. Not so there's not strong data on sleep and weight loss yet, because we're still doing those studies now. But we do know that not sleeping will cause you to gain weight. That we know. It's the weight loss story we're still looking into, and how that would work. In terms of productivity, I mean, that's crystal clear. We have tons of data showing that getting enough sleep not only helps people focus, pay more attention, make better decisions, have better memory function, better learning, all these sorts of things. Even strategic decisions, and especially complex decisions, tend to be better when you're well rested. Unfortunately, we also know that people are generally a bad judge of how impaired they are due to sleep loss. The longer you are sleep deprived, the worse of a judge you are about how sleep deprived you are. Sort of like being drunk. Like, the drunker you are, the less able to tell how drunk you are. It's sort of the same thing with sleep deprivation, where we can track performance with self-rated performance, and people, after about 4 or 5 days, they think they're leveling off. Objectively, they're not. They're still getting worse. They just don't notice.
Oh yeah, that's fascinating, and it maybe I think ties into someone who, okay, so say someone has sleep apnea, right, and they don't know it, and I think I have issues sleeping, so this kind of comes to mind personally. But if you are waking up the same way every day, it's tough to get out of bed. You get the coffee immediately, and you're off to your day, and then maybe you have a coffee around 2 or whatever. You've been living like that for so long, you may not know from your frame of reference really what it is to be living in that healthy space where you're getting the proper sleep, right? So from that person's perspective, it's, oh, okay, I'm fine, this is just how you feel, right? But it can be totally skewed. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, and this plays into creative people. So there's a belief among creative people that sleep deprivation leads to your best ideas, right?
Yeah.
And that's not totally wrong. Um, so this works in two different ways. One, in the middle of the night, some of the logical thinking, planning parts of your brain aren't working so well. That's why when you wake up in the middle of the night, a lot of times you blow things out of proportion, and you panic about stuff, because you don't really have your normal level of emotional maturity in the middle of the night, because those parts of the brain become quiet even when you're awake.
Mm.
And we have data that suggests that might actually be why suicides go up at night, things like that. But it also means people might be able to have fewer boundaries in their thinking. And also, when people are sleep deprived, they don't have as good control over their thinking and their emotions and stuff. And so there might be cases where that could actually produce some output that is better. However, chronically, that's not a good idea. In addition to, besides health reasons,
Mm.
Over time, there's actually data that shows that it reduces creativity. So, like, in the short term, yeah, maybe you might have a burst of creativity or something, But long term, it'll actually impair your ability to see things from different perspectives and understand how things work and think of things differently because you're just subsisting at that point. You're just sort of you're living on coffee and getting from one day to the next. You're not really having the resources to be creative. And so I think it's sort of a double-edged sword, where in some cases, yes, I will totally admit that sometimes not sleeping is good for creativity. But in the long term, it's not the case. That if anything, this is when people produce bad work that they think is really good.
Oh yeah, right.
And so I want to put that out there for the creative people that say, well, I do my best work when I'm sleep deprived. Like, well, sometimes you might, but
Mm.
on average, you probably won't, especially if you sustain that over long periods of time. What you're doing is you're getting, in the short term, you're getting some of the benefits of the more potentially open mind and fewer boundaries in your thinking while having banked some decent sleep to carry you through with some of those other brain functions. But once those supports go, you're getting more of a net loss than a net gain.
Oh, that's so interesting. And I definitely wanted to touch on that because from my perspective, having these conversations with producers on given episodes or just friends who are also making music, it's almost across the board. Everyone says, "Hey, I get into a more creative space when I am sleep deprived," right? And so I just thought that was the most fascinating thing to speak about because there's this juxtaposition right there. It's the research shows, hey, you need lots of sleep to be cognitively healthy, right? And but at the same point, there's this difference there, and oh, I just think that's really fascinating. Um, and eh, I would wonder too if the things that come up on this podcast so frequently and that I think are just so interesting are a lot of times a musician will or a producer or whatnot will find kind of by stumbling around what works best for them. And oftentimes it's something like this. And there are these iconic stories of people like Louis Armstrong who would warm up with a group of musicians for hours and hours before actually performing because he wanted to get in such a fatigued state that um all of the kind of bad habits are almost worked out of him in a way. And then and I think these things are so fascinating because they're almost brought on by chance or by not chance but just stumbling upon something that seems to work, and I think this is one of them, right? Producers will stay up maybe late a couple times and realize, oh, I came up with that really great idea, but seeing that this information is there, that okay, maybe in the short term, yes, there that can happen, but in the long term there are a lot of negative health repercussions to really consider as you kind of traverse this path as to creating music.
So if you've got musicians and producers listening to this, I've got an analogy that might make sense. Tell me if this
Mm.
makes sense. So I think it's the difference between if you've had one or two drinks, that might be a great way to reduce some inhibitions and maybe break down some barriers and maybe get some juices flowing.
Mm.
But if you're trashed, you're not producing good work.
Agreed. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great analogy. Yeah.
Um, and so think about it that way. It's not about, I have to be totally sleep deprived. It's not that the sleep deprivation is causing good work. Yeah, the lack of sleep might be opening up some doors,
Mm.
but you don't want them all open because then it's even worse. So like there's a difference between a musician who's had two beers before going on and is a little more relaxed and is a little more less inhibited, versus someone who's drunk on stage.
Yeah. Oh, that makes perfect sense. And then, even the repetition over time, if say, okay, two drinks kind of loosen me up, and then over time two becomes three, three becomes four, and then over time everything's trashed down the road, even if it's just this kind of gradual growth into something like that. So these things have to be really well internally monitored to understand, you know, okay, am I doing what I want on the front end in terms of what I'm creating versus how am I am I living a healthy lifestyle that this can actually move into the future? Because hey, maybe in 10 years this music thing is really taking off. Am I on a crash, am I on a trajectory to be in an early grave in 10 years, right? So these things are really important to speak about. Yeah. Now earlier you mentioned CBDI for insomnia. What was that you were mentioning?
Yeah, so that's CBTI stands for Cognitive Behavior Therapy for Insomnia.
Mm.
which is a label. There's other things called cognitive behavior therapy, but CBTI is different from any other kinds of therapy or even other kinds of CBT. What it is it's built on the premise that people who um, have insomnia mostly because they trained their brain to be awake in bed. Usually
Mm.
that's because when people, so most people have some underlying vulnerability to insomnia. For some people, they're great sleepers. For some people, they're just anxious people and they're going to develop insomnia. So some people have a varying level of where you start out. Some people start out with two strikes against them and some start out with none. But no
Mm.
matter where you start out, people who have insomnia invariably have something that pushes them over the line into an insomnia domain. Nearly 100% of people in at least Western society have at least some period of at least short-term insomnia, where something keeps you up, makes you lose sleep. But what happens is, over time, that's supposed to go away, and most of the time it does. But the times that it doesn't because the insomnia takes on a life of its own. And if anything, you inadvertently train yourself to wake up in bed. So a lot of times people will say, I'm really tired, but I get into bed and I just can't fall asleep.
Mm.
Um, or like, and a sure sign of this is when people say that, no matter how tired I am, I just can't shut my mind off. I just get into bed and I just can't shut my mind off. Or when they say something like, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I know I'm going to be up for a while. It's because you learned these things. And it's just like, for a musician, for example, if when you go into the studio, all you do is either write or perform, you're not socializing in there, eating in there, doing other stuff in there, that helps get you in that zone when you walk through the door. Having a limited number of things that you're doing in there helps you get into the right mindset. But if you say lived in the studio and slept there and worked there and ate there and socialized there and did your taxes there or whatever, the ability of that place to put you in that zone gets diluted. And that's what a lot of people do with the bed because they spend so much time in the bed not sleeping. And if anything, you're replacing it with something like worrying and tossing and turning and being uncomfortable and stressing about not sleeping, then that's what gets repeated over and over again. And that actually becomes the behavior that gets learned. And so by chasing after lost sleep in bed, the insomnia takes hold and it becomes learned. And what CBTI is, it's really a set of tools to reprogram your brain to reteach you how to sleep in bed. It's a lot more like, it's called therapy, but it's a lot more like potty training than psychotherapy.
Mm.
You're teaching your body how to do something it physically is capable of doing. It just doesn't quite know how to do it.
Interesting. So then what are some of the tactics then that okay, so to retrain yourself, what's that look like? Is it just removing yourself from if I feel anxious, then getting out and doing something else?
So anyone can do that. That's sort of like a step one
Okay.
is regularize your schedule a little bit and if you can't sleep, get out of bed.
Mm.
Um, if you're in it, how long do you stay in bed? Everyone's a little different. The general rule of thumb is 20 to 30 minutes, but most people know when that switch goes off and they're like, yeah, no, I'm not sleeping. So that's the time to get up. Because one thing I tell my patients is um, sleep isn't a behavior. Sleep isn't something you can do.
Mm.
Sleep is something that happens to you. The only thing you have control over is the situation. And if the situation's not conducive, you're not going to sleep. Sometimes you can control the situation, and sometimes you can't. If there's something in the situation that you cannot control that is going to preclude sleep, you can't force yourself to sleep. If your mind is going a million miles an hour and you're not going to be able to sleep, unless you can physically slow your mind down, which most people can't, don't try sleeping during that time. It's sort of like if you're hungry, if you want to be able to eat, but you're not hungry, do you sit down at the dinner table and just wait to be hungry? Like, do you sit there for hours and hours and I just can't get hungry? No,
Yeah.
you get up, you do other things, you wait till you're hungry and then you sit down. And sometimes, some days maybe you're just not hungry for lunch or you don't eat very much. But then the next day you're even a little more hungry and you make up for it. And so the first thing we tell people, and this is something you can tell anybody, is, and everyone should be doing this, if you can't sleep, get out of bed. If you're having a rough week, and you don't really have insomnia, but you're just having a rough week, get out of bed. You're not doing yourself any favors. You'll make up for it later. But then if that's not enough, um, there are other tools and techniques too, where what we do is we manipulate your schedule. We figure out what your biological ability to sleep is and your biological sleep timing, and we work with that to boost your body's own ability to sleep. And then over time we sort of break down your sleep and build it right back up again, and hopefully better than it was before. And the reason it works is, instead of like a sleeping pill where you're dragging yourself kicking and screaming into unconsciousness, um, which is going to come with side effects. I mean, it just is because of that. What you're doing is you're retraining your brain's ability to sleep. Most people, that's all that they need. And then not only does it work, but it works next time because now you know how to do it, as opposed to a sleeping pill which stops working when you stop taking it, which is why the medical organizations that do the prescribing of the medications, their official positions are, if you can get access to a clinician trained in CBTI, do that. Don't even bother with medications at first. Only if that fails do you think about medications. And even then, don't get your hopes up too high because they don't work quite as well as everyone thinks they do.
Wow, that's fascinating. I just, and touching in on a couple of those things with the sleep aids and other things, maybe like substances like alcohol. What do those? What are the effects of those at a neurological level or a cognitive level? I mean, and what I've heard so far, and this is just kind of hearsay, I guess. I'm not very close to the research, but you don't actually get into an actual deep sleep when, say, you're using some of those sleep aids, or if you have, a couple drinks on the weekend and you go to sleep late.
So, in terms of prescription sleep medication, like the Ambiens and other sedative medications like that, one of the ways that they work to get you to sleep is they suppress. They suppress your consciousness. They suppress your awareness. They're actually very chemically similar to anti-anxiety medications. It's just they're working on similar receptors using a similar neurotransmitter. It's just slightly different. So, but instead of blocking your caring and having the side effect of also blocking some consciousness and making you sleepy, they sort of have the other way where they're mostly blocking sort of your ability to focus and stay awake, while also sort of maybe having some anti-anxiety in there too. But it also slows down things like your reaction time and your heart rate and all these other things because they suppress. But what they're also doing is they might also be suppressing the deeper sleep from happening. So the sleep that you have on them is noticeably more shallow. For some people, it's way better than what they were getting before. But compared to an ideal, it's usually not great, and it's usually not quite as restorative. That's part of why people still feel foggy and groggy in the morning, but it's mostly just because also the medications are still in the system. So they can be helpful, especially for a short-term problem. But long-term, they tend not to be great long-term, and they do tend to suppress the more helpful stages of sleep in the beginning parts of the night. Alcohol is similar, but a little bit different. It does work on a similar system where it is suppressing the more restful sleep at the beginning of the night and making your sleep more shallow. But unlike prescription medications, alcohol goes through your system very fast, right? Remember, it's like an hour per drink, right, for a typical person, as opposed to a medication which will stay in your system for hours and hours and hours. Now, what that means is, as you're drinking, it can make you more sleepy. So alcohol can get you to sleep faster, even if the sleep you're getting on it is a little more shallow. But because the alcohol gets processed and leaves your system pretty quickly, that same night you will get the effects of the alcohol leaving the system as entering the system, and that'll be the opposite effect. So one of the things that happens is, as alcohol gets converted by your body and your liver into other molecules as it gets processed, those molecules that the alcohol molecule gets turned into can be stimulating. Not only that, the liver itself, if it's working really hard to process that alcohol, once it's done a couple hours later, it'll start ramping back up production of the molecules it used to process that alcohol, because now it was depleted, now it's replenishing. Well, when those get out into the bloodstream, some of those, like glutamine, in other parts of the body can become stimulating. So what a lot of people will talk about is, they drank and they passed out, but then they woke up and their sleep was really shallow and they couldn't get back to sleep. And that was actually also the alcohol. The alcohol at the beginning of the night got them to sleep, but a few hours in, it woke them up.
Oh, that's fascinating. That's fascinating because I know some people, there's always that, that nightcap idea, right? A drink before, and that's a little outdated now, I think, but it really just speaks to there's no free lunch, right? You can't try and introduce different chemicals into your body and expect that, okay, it's just gonna put you into a deep sleep and that's it, no repercussions at all, right? I mean, it's interesting for that reason to learn a little bit more about these at the chemical level as to what's really going on, because I think commonly people have the idea that, okay, I'm not going to get the best sleep, but really understanding what that mechanism is, I think it's really fascinating.
Yeah, but that also means 1 to 2 drinks is probably not going to make a big difference,
Mm.
because you're not metabolizing so much that it's releasing these large amounts of products into your system. Yeah, 1 to 2 drinks is probably not going to do too much. I mean, if it's not making you super sleepy, it's not going to make you super awake later either. Um, Another thing I do want to mention that a lot of people in the creative industry are using is nicotine.
Mm.
Um, Whether they're smoking or vaping or whatever, nicotine as a molecule is a stimulant, even if people smoke to relax. Um, and it is a stimulant, and there's data that shows that people who smoke take longer to fall asleep. And especially if you're ingesting nicotine in the middle of the night, it can make sleep way more shallow and sleep problems way worse during the night. Um, so a lot of people don't realize that nicotine is actually a stimulant. It might relax you mentally, but not physically.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, yeah.
That's why a lot of people lose weight when smoking. Not only does it suppress appetite, it's part of the stimulant effect. Um, the other thing that I want to mention that people think about is melatonin. So a lot of
Mm.
people take melatonin. Melatonin is not a sleeping pill. It's a hormone that your body produces, and it's not a hormone that tells your body to sleep. And so that's why taking it won't necessarily get you to sleep. What melatonin does in your body is it essentially tells your body it's nighttime, right? So if you take it during the day, it's not going to have much of an effect because your body knows it's nighttime, not nighttime. If you take it right at bedtime or in the middle of the night, it's going to have little to no effect because your body already knows it's nighttime. It tends to have effects at the boundaries, like in the evening or like first thing in the morning. If you want to
Mm.
be able to stay up late, maybe a little bit of melatonin first thing in the morning can extend your biological night a little bit, trick your body into thinking, oh no, it's still nighttime, it's not day yet, which will start the clock a little late, which might help you stay up late. Or if you're trying to go to bed a little earlier, you take it in the evening, way before going to bed, right when your body's trying to tell whether the sun's going down and it's nighttime. That's actually a good time. And also, it's not like a drug where the higher dose is more effective. Because it's a hormone, not a drug, and it's you're using it to send a signal to your body, and because of that, it's only looking within a certain window of concentration. So if you have too high of a concentration, you're not getting a bigger effect. You're just getting more side effects. So when people say that, well, I take melatonin, it didn't help me sleep, well, it's because telling your body it was nighttime wasn't the problem. That's why it doesn't work well for insomnia. It can work well for more mild sleep problems or when people are in environments where they're not getting no natural light exposure, like people stuck in a studio all day. So that could be a good signal to, if you're doing that, take one in the evening and your body might help, it might help your body recognize when nighttime is happening so you'll be able to fall asleep a little faster. But it's not going to knock you out. It's not a sedative in that way.
Huh. And speaking to the same idea then, so kind of speaking to your body and setting this biological clock as to when it's light out, when it's dark out, I would assume that staring at a screen all evening or looking at your cell phone right before bed, that has to have very negative effects for trying to tell your body, hey, it's time to sleep.
Yeah, light that hits the retina, it goes to the brain, to the visual system because it helps you see. Before it goes to the visual system, its first stop in the brain is actually your clock.
Hmm.
And And it's trying to tell your body, is it daytime, nighttime, or one of these transitions? And so the brain doesn't know what artificial light is. We evolved long before we invented artificial light. And so when the eye sees light, especially light in the blue-green spectrum, because that's what you see in daylight. That's the sky, the trees, the grass, the ocean. I mean, that's the natural world in daylight. That's the frequencies of light that hit the retina. When it sees white, which contains blue and green, or blue-green light, it's like, oh, this must be daylight. And so when you get that later in the night, your brain's like, okay, well, I thought it was evening. Guess it's not yet. Let me keep going. And eventually, it'll keep you up later than you need to by getting that light in there. The thing about light from screens is actually the light coming off these screens really isn't super bright. It's just the screen is so close to your face that all of the light is getting in your eye,
Yeah.
as opposed to like a television on the other side of the room, which most of that light is diffused around the room. It's not all getting straight into your eyes. And so that's why it's a great thing to use those blue light filters, whether it's software or even just glasses. Blue blocking glasses can be tremendously effective at, you get light into your eyes for the visual system to see, but the clock isn't seeing anything blue or green, so it's not delaying the production of melatonin. Where if wake up in the middle of the night, let's say you're traveling, you're in a hotel room, and you turn on a bright bathroom light, light suppresses melatonin even in the middle of the night, because that's part of the natural system and how it works. So that bright light will then suppress your melatonin. You turn off the light, your body still knows it's nighttime, it'll start ramping it back up again, but it might make it harder to fall back asleep, especially if you're waking up near where dawn is, and then your body's like, I guess that was dawn, let me just start my day. And so you can, for good or for bad, you can trick the system that way. So if you want to block white, blue, and green light, that will help your natural cycle emerge and be free to do what it wants to do.
Oh yeah, that's so interesting, and I think that those things are so important to know because there is just over the last 10 years an explosion I guess, yeah, 10 years, an explosion in using cell phones, televisions. People are sending work emails late, right? They're on their computer right before they go to bed, or they're watching Netflix right before they go to bed. And of course, it makes sense that there's going to be an impact, right? And if people are now suffering more commonly from insomnia or having, I guess that's the same thing, having trouble falling asleep, right? Same kind of idea. It makes sense. It makes sense. Society has shifted so quickly as to this obsession with technology and this obsession with work performance, and really sleep has been put in the back seat, I think, for a lot of this. And I've seen these conversations coming up more and more in different podcasts I listen to, or just, I don't know, it comes up more frequently. And I think it's just so important to speak about this because everything has been fascinating, but right off the bat, when you mention anything sub 6 hours, you mention the increase in obesity likelihood, heart disease, diabetes. That's incredible. I mean, I think people may not know those statistics, and I think that stuff is just super, super important.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that an important element in here that we can't forget is that light is just one of two important ingredients, which is how technology keeps people up. The other one is the mental activity. There's a big difference between relaxation and distraction. Distraction can be very helpful. It's not bad. It's just we don't need as much of it as we think we do. Watching TV and sometimes work is very distracting. And so if it's the sort of activity like, binge watching a TV show where hours will go by and you hardly notice, it's too distracting and you're delaying sleep. So especially if you're someone who says you don't have time for sleep, I bet that if you turn the TV off an hour before you normally do, your life quality would not be that much worse for not having seen that last hour of television. But
right.
You now have an extra hour to wind down. We don't need to be as distracted as we think we do a lot of the time. And the other thing is that if you're doing these sorts of activities, you're not noticing how much time is passing. and you're not noticing your buildup of sleep drive, especially if by the time you get into bed, for the people who get into bed and their head hits the pillow and they're out,
Mm.
that's like saying, you put a plate of food in front of me, it's clean in 10 seconds. It's like, well, you were too hungry. Like, why didn't
Right.
you eat an hour ago if you were that hungry? Well, it's because you didn't notice. You weren't paying attention to how hungry you were. And when we're so distracted, especially with TV, the data is showing that TV is driving a lot of this, but honestly, smartphones are probably starting to take over.
Mm.
But even people who work at night, this is a problem for them. If you're in front of a computer late at night, you're so distracted, you're not noticing an hour or two go by. When maybe, put it down. If you woke up a little early, if you went to bed now, woke up a little earlier, a little more refreshed, you'll actually have much better responses. You'll be more efficient. You'll be thinking way more clearly about whatever it is you're doing. And if you're just watching one more episode of a show, the great thing about TV these days is if you miss it, it's still there tomorrow. It doesn't care whether you watched it tonight. It'll still be there, waiting for
Yeah.
you.
Yeah, absolutely. The Netflix shows aren't going away, and the computer's going to be there, so you can work on that track tomorrow. It all can be put on pause, and I think one thing you just mentioned there is just if you were to give yourself that extra hour, and go to sleep, the next day you're gonna wake up with you're gonna be more clear-headed, better cognitive function. You're going to be healthier. So for those reasons, that next day is going to be more productive. And if you're more productive, maybe you can get more things done in a shorter amount of time if that's really what you're looking to do. So and I mean, I guess across the board, Netflix isn't really ever adding too much productivity to one's day, but right, it's there for when we like it. But yeah, I just think that's so fascinating, and I'm really appreciative to have this conversation. Eh, one last thing I want to mention is I just think it's so cool that you started out, with this fascination of dreams, and it's kind of grown into this career where now you're at the forefront speaking about these things and doing the research. And at the same time, I think that this topic is being accepted, and it's being better understood as something that's so important. So for that reason, it must just be a very exciting time to be doing this research.
It's really awesome. It's a great time to be a sleep person and be in the field. It's growing. It used to be more of a small, the sleep conference used to be very small, and now there's 8,000 people that attend every year. This the big scientific conference, and where all the doctors and scientists who study sleep all come together. It used to be way smaller. Now it's much bigger, and that's just so amazing to see, because at least for me, like, look, I'm not um, say this isn't saving the world. This isn't the only important thing in the universe, but it's universal. It's something that really applies to everyone. It's like everyone puts their pants on one foot at a time, and everyone sleeps. And if we can use that to make people's lives just that much better, to help people be that much healthier, be that much more in control of their weight, of their mental functioning, of their mental health, um, their productivity, I think that's a net good. And I think that here, in what ways can I help? And that's why I also think talking about stuff like this is so important, because sleep used to be like this black box mystery. We don't really understand why we sleep and how we sleep, and it's, what's it even for? Now we know a lot more. And the
Mm.
more we dig, the more we find. And I think that's a really important message, that, this idea that sleep is unproductive time, that that has long been dispensed with in the scientific literature. Like, we know it's actually quite productive. It's just you're not moving around very much, or at least you're not supposed to be. But it's actually very productive. Um, when we did a study with a bunch of elite athletes who never have time for sleep because they wake up at like 5 in the morning to train, and they're 20-year-olds, so they're up past midnight because they can't sleep early, and they're doing stuff at night. Um, and our goal was to help them sleep better, and we were able to increase their sleep time by more than an hour. Um, and we didn't actually increase their time in bed by an hour. We increased their time in bed by like a little more than a half an hour, about 40 minutes.
Mm.
Most of the actual time they spent sleeping, they were already spending it in bed anyway. We helped make their sleep more efficient, and we helped them be more productive by taking more time out. I mean, they talked about how it improved their academic functioning, their mental health, their physical performance, their athletic performance. And I think if more people knew that sleep is not the enemy. Sleep is your friend. It's like a healthy diet where, like,
Yeah.
look, you don't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be absolutely optimized and perfect to get the benefits. But if you forget about it, if you ignore it, if you don't prioritize it at least a little bit, you're missing out.
Oh yeah. I oh man, I totally agree. I just think that's so cool. And the way that you mentioned that, hey, with the research that you were doing recently, it wasn't, hey, change your lifestyle so you can be in bed more. It was better understanding how to make it efficient sleep and good healthy quality sleep. And that's another thing is and I'm just thinking about this for myself personally. I don't think I sleep well. I have a deviated septum. I knew this for almost 10 years now, and I haven't done anything about it. I think I have sleep apnea for that reason. And I wake up tired. And these kind of things, understanding the importance here, that's now pushing me, and I hope listeners out there as well, to make changes. Like, I want to figure out what that is this year and get that corrected, because it's not. I think maybe the misconception for someone who's missing sleep is, it's not a big deal. I'll just be tired and whatever. I can kind of drink my coffee and get through the day. But it's totally beyond that. It's 10, 20, 30 years later in life. This is going to have a sizable impact if you don't make those proper adjustments now and continue into the future to do so. I mean, it can really have some real negative benefits moving in, or negative repercussions, moving into the future.
So when I work with patients and professionals who are just looking to optimize and stuff, one of the phrases I hear a lot from them is focusing on sleep and helping to fix this issue has helped turn good into great.
Mm.
And you have people who are elite performers, especially in the industry you're talking about. You have people who are really good at what they do, and they have ways of doing it. And there might be a ceiling. How much are you going to improve? But really, it's not about an obvious transformative change. It's more about this subtle transformative change where all of a sudden things that were a problem aren't as much of a problem. You're able to do more. You're able to think more clearly. And I mean, that's the goal. I mean, you're already good. Let's take you to great.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I totally agree. I think that's super important, and you're right. It's these subtleties. It's something that you may not necessarily pick up on right away. You may, again, as I mentioned earlier, you sometimes don't even know if you're in this sub level of sleep and the sub level of performance, just because that's your perspective, right? And you don't know until you see those differences. And yeah, I think that this is really going to translate well for those people out there. I mean, across the board, music producers I mentioned earlier, barely sleeping, and I think that this access to information is critical. Yeah, and yeah. Oh yeah, thank you. And one thing I like to mention towards the end is I would be on or more than happy to or to do these in the future if, say, the research changes in a year or something like that, or new bits of research come to light that really influence this conversation or change this conversation. I would love to continue this conversation in the future and speak more about this. It'd be awesome.
Yeah, that would be great. I think the more we get people talking about this. So that's the thing about sleep is once you get people talking, sometimes it's hard to get people to stop talking. And I'm not talking about just me. Where if you walk into a room, and I mean this happens if I'm speaking in a room of professionals, whether I'm in Washington D.C. talking to government people, or if I am on an athletics team, whether it's football or basketball or whatever, whoever it is, you say sleep, you get stories.
Yeah.
And I think this has a potential to help people, to actually help people be closer to who they're trying to be, and help people get to where they're trying to go, no matter where you're coming from or what your job is or how busy you are. I think there's a lot of potential here. And I mean, we've already talked a lot, but as you could probably tell, we could go for hours on this.
Oh yeah, absolutely, and I'd love to do so. These and that's one reason why I love to keep this so free form, just to go in any direction, because that's when I think these great conversations come up and really dig into the research and we really dig into what exactly it is you're looking to do and all these things. I just think that's so important. Yeah, yeah. So one thing I like to mention as well is for people out there that are interested in learning more about this, where one, your research, right? So people that are interested in learning more about your research, where can they go to look? And then specifically, if people are interested in better understanding the importance of sleep, better understanding healthy sleep, what are some great resources out there for them to look towards?
Yeah, that's a good question. I wish there was more out there. Um, there are some good books that are out there that have come out in the last year or two that I think explain the importance of sleep in a pretty good way. Um, I there's in terms of resources online, there's more stuff coming out, and there's some professional organizations that have good content that's vetted. Things like the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, or the Sleep Research Society, or the Society of Behavioral Sleep Medicine, or the National Sleep Foundation. They tend to be generally good. Um, I wish there were a great source off the top of my head that I can think of that's a great one-stop shop for everything you need to know. Um, we're so new. I mean, this has only been the last few years that people have really been paying attention. So the stuff is just coming out.
Mhm.
But actually, I wouldn't mind offering up my contact information if people have a question, if people are looking for a resource. Um, you can get a hold of me. I'm not hard to get a hold of. I mean, Google my last name. I'll come up, or just go to michaelgrander.com, or go to the University of Arizona website and search for my name. Drop me an email, and I'll help direct you. Or even if someone's saying, look, I might have a sleep problem, I don't even know who to talk to, I'll say, where do you live? I probably, if I don't know someone in your area, I'm a member of all the professional organizations where we have all our membership lists. I can find someone in your area that you could probably talk to and get some good help from. Um, I'm happy to help. I feel like this is I sort of see this as my moral obligation, being a good citizen, and help connect people with the resources until there's a really good one-stop shop for everything.
Yeah, wow, thank you. I feel like, I mean, that's very kind, just to offer that for listeners to tie in with you and get that information. Yeah, thank you, and thank you for doing this. It's always so funny to reach out, via email or social media, and in some cases for previous episodes, and ask to do a podcast and all this stuff. So I really do appreciate you doing it. And just to speak to what you just mentioned, I think that as this is new, I just think it's so cool because you have this now platform, and you're sharing this message, which I think is just super important.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And that is it. Episode 23. Thank you again so much to Dr. Michael Gradner for coming on, having this conversation. I greatly appreciate it, and just feel so fortunate that I'm able to have this conversation, put out these episodes, and have you out there listening. Also, not to forget Sun for sharing that song at the beginning of today's episode, I Dream. I highly recommend checking out Audio Apostles and Serenade Production Studio that I had mentioned at the beginning of the episode. Lastly, before we cut things off, if you are enjoying these episodes, please consider supporting the podcast via Patreon. So patreon.com/chasing creativity. It's how this thing is going to really continue into the future, and it's how we're going to continue to bring on great guests, etc. So that's it. Look for more episodes coming weekly, and I look to speak with you all again soon. With you all again soon. With you all again soon. With you all again soon.